4. When you look at the dynamic between an avoidant and an anxious partner, one of the most overlooked truths is this: the avoidant rarely realizes, in the moment, just how much stability they're being given. Think about that for a second, because on the surface, 4. The anxious partner looks like the one who's always in need, always checking in, always seeking reassurance, always trying to hold the relationship together. 4. And the avoidant, from their perspective, can misinterpret that consistency as pressure, as suffocation, or as a demand they can't meet. But what happens over time? 4. What almost always comes to light once the anxious partner finally steps away is that the avoidant recognizes that this very energy, the persistence, 4. The reliability, the willingness to invest day after day, was actually the foundation of their stability. You see, avoidants live in a state of self-protection, or their walls are high, and their instinct is to pull back whenever things feel too close. But the paradox is this: while they're busy pulling back, 4, they're still benefiting from the security blanket that the anxious partner is weaving around them. They don't consciously acknowledge it, 4, because it feels like it will always be there. The anxious partner becomes the emotional constant, the person who shows up, 4, who doesn't walk away at the first sign of tension, who continually extends connection even when rejected. And that creates a kind of hidden safety net. 4. The avoidant may resist intimacy, but deep down they're leaning on that stability more than they know. Now, here's where regret begins to take root. The moment that consistency is gone, the avoidant feels a void. It's not always immediate. It might creep in days, weeks, or months later. At first, they may believe they're relieved that they finally have the space they craved. But human beings are wired for connection, even those who fear it most. 4. And without that constant heartbeat of reassurance, without the text that always came, the presence that always stayed, they're left with silence. That silence doesn't just highlight the absence of the anxious partner. It forces them to confront their own loneliness. The irony is profound. The very stability they once resisted is the thing they now miss. And here's the deeper psychological layer: stability isn't just about routine. 4. It's about emotional grounding. The anxious partner offers a mirror that reflects, you matter, you're worth showing up for, 4, you're worth fighting for. Losing that mirror leaves the avoidant facing only themselves. And for many, that's a confrontation they're not prepared for. 4. From a philosophical standpoint, it's like water. When you have it every day, you take it for granted. You assume the cup will always be full. But when the well runs dry, you realize water wasn't just convenient. It was life-giving. The anxious partner, in their consistency, 4, provides that same life-giving nourishment to the emotional landscape of the avoidant. Once gone, the desert becomes unbearable. And here's the truth: for regret doesn't stem only from losing the person. It stems from realizing you misjudged the value of what they gave. That stability wasn't weakness. 4. It wasn't dependency. It was love in action, love in motion, love that showed up again and again, even when it wasn't easy. The regret of the avoidant, 4, in the end, is not just about losing the anxious partner. It's about losing the stability they didn't know they needed. For the anchor they didn't realize was holding them steady. The devotion they couldn't see until it was too late. 4. And that regret cuts deeper than loneliness. It cuts into the very fabric of what it means to be human, the need to be held, to be seen, and to be safe. If there's one truth about the anxious partner that the avoidant often doesn't realize until it's too late, 4, it's the sheer depth of love and devotion they bring into the relationship. This isn't surface-level affection. 4, it's not the casual kind of attachment that drifts in and out depending on convenience. No, what the anxious partner offers is something far rarer. 4, a love that is wholehearted, unwavering, and deeply invested in the well-being of the connection. 4, and here's the paradox. While that depth of devotion may feel overwhelming to the avoidant in the moment, once it's gone, 4, it leaves a hole that is almost impossible to fill. Think about it. An anxious partner doesn't just love with words, they love with their presence, with their effort, with their willingness to stay engaged even when things get messy. They're not the type to give up easily, 4, because their very wiring is oriented toward closeness and connection. They will fight for the relationship not out of fear alone, 4, but out of a genuine desire to preserve something meaningful. That kind of tenacity, that refusal to walk away lightly, is something many avoidants take for granted. But once it's gone, they begin to see just how rare that kind of devotion really is. Because let's be honest, most people today don't want to lean all the way in. 4. Many relationships collapse under pressure because one or both partners simply don't have the capacity to withstand discomfort. But the anxious partner, for all their struggles with overthinking or seeking reassurance, has a gift, for they are willing to endure that discomfort if it means holding on to the person they love. They may cry, they may question, they may reach out too much, but all of that is rooted in one undeniable truth: they care deeply, and caring that deeply is not weakness, it is courage. The tragedy is that avoidants often confuse devotion with dependency. They look at that constant pursuit of closeness and interpret it as a flaw, as a weight they don't want to carry. What they don't realize, until much later, is that very devotion was proof of the kind of love most people spend their lives searching for. Because here's the reality: once the anxious partner is gone, the avoidant may find new connections, new partners, even new adventures. But those connections rarely hold the same intensity. They lack that same unwavering loyalty, that sense of being loved with every ounce of someone's heart. From a psychological perspective, this is where the regret deepens. The avoidant isn't just missing a person, they're missing the experience of being loved without reservation. The anxious partner doesn't love halfway. When they commit, they pour themselves into the relationship. And losing that means losing not just a partner, but the rare experience of being fully chosen. That realization doesn't come quickly, but when it does, it lands with a weight that's hard to shake. On a philosophical level, it speaks to something profound about human nature. We all crave to be loved without conditions, without hesitation, without the fear that someone will abandon us when things get tough. And while avoidance may push away in fear of that very intimacy, they eventually come to realize that the anxious partner was giving them exactly what they feared and exactly what they needed. That devotion was not a chain. It was freedom, the freedom to be fully seen and still fully loved. And so the regret becomes more than missing a person. It becomes missing the rarest kind of love. A love that doesn't retreat, doesn't withhold, doesn't calculate. A love that dives all the way in. That's what the avoidant loses when they lose the anxious partner. And once they've experienced that kind of devotion, everything else feels shallow by comparison. Because here's the truth: there is no substitute for being loved deeply, fully, and without reservation. And when that love is gone, the avoidant learns the hardest lesson of all. Nothing else will ever. One of the most powerful moments in any relationship with an anxious partner comes not at the beginning, not in the middle, but at the end, when they finally decide to withdraw. And what's important to understand here is that anxious partners don't walk away impulsively. They don't leave on a whim or cut ties casually. When they step back, it's after they've exhausted every ounce of effort, every attempt to repair, every plea for closeness. Their withdrawal doesn't happen because they stopped caring. It happens because they've been drained to the point where there's simply nothing left to give. And this is the exact moment when the avoidant begins to feel the weight of loss in a way they never anticipated. For so long, the anxious partner's presence is constant. They are the one who reaches out, who sends the text, who asks the hard questions, who keeps the connection alive even when the avoidant is pulling away. To the avoidant, this can feel suffocating, like pressure they never asked for. But what they don't see is that this consistent effort is the glue that's holding the relationship together. And once that glue is gone, the cracks that were once manageable suddenly split wide open. The silence that follows an anxious partner's withdrawal is not an ordinary silence, it is deafening. It's the kind of silence that confronts the avoidant with a truth they've worked hard to avoid. They were never as independent as they believed. They leaned on the anxious partner's persistence more than they realized. They relied on the fact that, no matter how much they pulled back, someone would still be there, knocking on the door, refusing to let the connection die. When that's no longer the case, the avoidant isn't just left with space, they're left with emptiness. Here's the irony: what once felt like suffocation now feels like oxygen. The very presence they resisted becomes the presence they crave. And this isn't just about missing a person, it's about missing the energy, the reassurance, the sense of being wanted so intensely that someone would fight for them over and over again. That withdrawal exposes the truth the avoidant has been running from. For their fear of closeness did not protect them. It robbed them of the one thing they didn't know they needed. From a psychological perspective, this shift is monumental. Human beings are wired for connection. 4. Even those who have built elaborate defense mechanisms to avoid intimacy still have the same fundamental need to be bonded, to be understood, to be seen. When the anxious partner finally withdraws, 4. The avoidant has to face not only the loss of the relationship, but also the absence of the very force that kept them tethered to that deep, 4. Primal need for connection. It is in this void that regret begins to grow, and often it grows relentlessly. Philosophically, it's a lesson about absence. 4. You never truly understand the value of a heartbeat until it stops. You never fully grasp the power of light until you're left in darkness. For the anxious partner's withdrawal teaches this lesson in the harshest possible way. The avoidant who once believed they wanted freedom, 4. comes to see that freedom without love, without connection, without intimacy is not liberation, it is loneliness, 4. And this is the point where the regret crystallizes into something undeniable. Because it's not just about losing a partner, 4. It's about losing the experience of being consistently chosen over and over until the very end. That kind of devotion, once gone, 4. leaves a silence that no distraction, no rebound, no new adventure can fill. Because here's the truth: when the anxious partner finally withdraws, the avoidant is left not with peace, but with emptiness, 4. And that emptiness is the echo of a love they once resisted, and what the avoidant eventually comes to understand, often much too late, 4. is that the anxious partner is not replaceable, and that realization doesn't happen overnight. It unfolds slowly, 4. In the quiet moments when the avoidant begins to notice that no one else mirrors that same depth of empathy, that same intuition, for that same relentless ability to see beneath the surface. At first, they may tell themselves that moving on will be easy, 4. They convince themselves that a new relationship, someone more independent, will feel lighter, less demanding. And in the beginning, it might, 4. But as time passes, they begin to sense the difference, the absence of a bond that went beyond words, beyond convenience, beyond superficial attraction, 4. They start to see that what they lost was not just a partner, but a rare kind of soul connection that doesn't come around often in life. The anxious partner, for all their struggles, carries a gift that few others do: the ability to love with depth and to perceive with precision. They can sense shifts in mood, 4. Unspoken feelings, hidden insecurities. That kind of emotional radar is not something everyone has, and it's not something easily found again once it's gone. For the avoidant, who often struggles to articulate their own inner world, the anxious partner becomes a kind of translator, 4. They give language to what the avoidant cannot say. They offer comfort before the avoidant even asks, and they extend loyalty when it hasn't always been earned. 4. It is only in losing this that the avoidant realizes just how extraordinary it was. Here's where the pain of regret sharpens. 4. The avoidant may find new partners who are attractive, who are interesting, who are easier. But easy doesn't equal meaningful. Without that depth, 4, those relationships feel shallow, transactional, like a performance rather than a true meeting of hearts, 4. And when the avoidant tries to recreate the kind of intimacy they once resisted, 4, they quickly learn that not everyone has the capacity to love at the level the anxious partner did. 4. That's when the truth sinks in. What they lost cannot be replicated. From a psychological standpoint, this recognition is profound. For human beings thrive on uniqueness. We don't want to feel interchangeable, and we don't want to believe our connections are replaceable. 4. When the avoidant recognizes that the anxious partner was in fact irreplaceable, 4. It's not just a regret about the past, it's an existential confrontation with their own choices. They realize they turned away from something extraordinary, not because it wasn't valuable, but because they were too afraid to let themselves receive it. Philosophically, it touches on the human condition itself. 4. Most of us go through life searching for people who truly see us, who accept both our flaws and our strengths, who stay even when things get complicated. To find such a person is a rare gift. To lose them is to lose not just a relationship, but a reflection of who we could have been if we had allowed ourselves to grow through love rather than run from it. 4. And that's the ultimate regret for the avoidant. Not just losing the anxious partner, but realizing that in rejecting them, 4, they rejected a version of themselves that could have learned to love more deeply, trust more fully, and live more authentically. The anxious partner's irreplaceability isn't just about their qualities. It's about the unique way they called something higher out of the avoidant, 4. Something the avoidant may never find again in another.